you can use Linq to write database, to query a database. And I thought, well, you can interactively write queries in SQL using tools like SQL Server Management Studio. So wouldn't it be great if you could do the same thing in Linq? So I wrote a tool to do that. That was LinqPad so you can just type Linq queries in interactively. And then once I released that, it became quite popular, and there were a lot of people using it, including a lot of folks at Microsoft were using it. And I was getting a lot of feature requests.
Welcome, friends, to the Modern.NET Show, the premier .NET podcast focusing entirely on the knowledge, tools, and frameworks that all .NET developers should have in their toolbox. We are the go-to podcast for .NET developers worldwide, and I am your host, Jamie Gaprogman-Taylor. In this episode, Joe Albahari joined us to talk about LinqPad. Yes, that LinqPad. The one tool that makes all .NET developers' lives easier. Don't worry about it if you've never heard of LinqPad, as Joe and I talk about why you should use it and how it can make your .NET life way more productive. We also talked about handling feature requests and building a development platform for other developers.
When something doesn't work correctly, it can be really hard to figure out what's going on. Sometimes it just requires experimentation. And that's something I dislike. I always like to try to understand exactly what's going on underneath and then try and, from that understanding, make something work. I don't just like trying random stuff.
We also round out our conversation by taking some questions from the community, which Joe graciously agreed to answer for us. Don't forget that you can join the community for free over at .NETCore.show/Discord, where you'll be able to connect with other listeners, share interesting links, propose episode ideas, and suggest questions for guests. After the recording, Joe and I spoke in depth about the possibility of a cross-platform version of LinqPad. Later that day, we recorded on May 2nd, 2024, I sent off an email introducing Joe to the team at Avalonia. And a few weeks before this episode dropped, Joe announced a version of LinqPad which is coming to macOS. How cool is that? Anyway, without further ado, let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and we'll dive into the core of modern .NET. So Joe, welcome to the show. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but it did, so there we are. It's fantastic to be chatting with you today. I'm a big fan of the product we're going to talk about. We've got some community questions from someone who's a big fan of the product we're going to talk about. But welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
My goodness, it's wonderful to have you here. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, so we are going to talk about a little bit about LinqPad and building almost like tools as a platform in .NET and things like that. But I thought before we did that, I wonder, could you perhaps give the listeners a bit of an intro to yourself? Is that all right?
Yes, certainly. I'm the author of C# in a nutshell from versions 3 to 12, and the creator of LinqPad, the popular .NET Scratchpad, that's where I spend most of my time. So if you haven't heard of LinqPad, give a really kind of quick summary. If you think of the .NET code Scratchpad, and a lot of people ask, what is a Scratchpad and why would I need it? I guess by way of analogy, if you imagine that a Visual Studio or any kind of project-centric .NET development tool is like a big truck. It's very versatile and can carry a lot of stuff. A code Scratchpad, it's like a high-performance motorcycle that can weave through traffic, get you somewhere quickly. So, yeah, in a nutshell, that's what LinqPad does.
Amazing. And you wrote the C# in a nutshell books as well. I can imagine that because I've seen the jokey images of like JavaScript, just the important parts, and JavaScript.
That's right.
Like they're really thin and really thick books.
That's right. And the nutshell is a coconut. It is a nut. It's just a really big nut. It covers the language and the CLR and the BCL. That's why it's so big. If it just covered the language, it would be a third of the size. So it'd be actually okay. But people, they want lots of value for my book. There's lots of stuff in there. So it's ended up being big because it takes on all these extra topics.
Sure. And I feel like C#, the language, can't easily be divorced from the CLR, right? So I say this: there are listeners who are of different levels, right, in their .NET and C# journey. For those who don't know, obviously C# is compiled to an intermediary language when you hit build, and when you run it, it's then sort of recompiled just in time to the bytecode for your machine. And the CLR is the thing that runs all of that stuff for you. That's like a super 10,000 foot low detailed view of it. But the point I'm getting at, which I'm doing really badly of getting at, is I suppose that C# and the other CLR languages can't easily be divorced from the CLR, because you kind of need to understand a little bit, not a great deal, but at least a little bit of how the CLR works in order to write optimized C#, F#, I suppose VB.
Yes, even VB. It's that's a really good point. It's there isn't and if you're writing a book on this, it's you can't completely segregate them. You kind of got to dovetail them because there is overlap, right, between those things.
100%, yeah. I think isn't it Scott Hanselman who says that it's always good to know a little bit about the next layer down, so that then you know kind of where your code is going before it's running.
That's right.
Firstly, if you know there's another layer down, that's great. And then if you know a little bit about how your code runs on that next layer down, you can then figure out, oh, cool. So this loop will, because it's a simple loop, maybe it's a for loop, this can actually be, by the compiler, can be turned into a series of statements that just, because if all I'm doing is a standard for int I equals 0 and just iterating over an array using brackets notation, if the compiler already knows how long the array is, then it could probably convert that. Instead of having a for loop that loops around a million times, it could probably say, well, I'll just write a million lines of code.
Yes.
That just, instead of using I, it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until the end of your counter, right?
It does a remarkably good job of that kind of optimization. And interestingly, in LinqPad, there is an IL tab. So any code you write, you can click that IL tab and it will give you 3 windows side by side. On the left, it shows you the conversion into C# 1.0. On the middle tab, it shows you the IL translation. And on the right-hand side, it shows you the x64 or x86 translation. So, and as you move the mouse through it, it then highlights each of the corresponding statements. So you can see everything from the lowering to C# 1 to the IL right down to the machine code.
Yeah, and yeah, I've used that in the past and gone, wow, this is crazy. That it's just to see that journey. I suppose we're jumping 1,000 steps ahead. So, but that's that. Yes, you're absolutely right. You need to know that stuff, and it's great that LinqPad includes it. So let's step back a little bit and talk a little bit about LinqPad then. So, for those who haven't used it, I wonder, could you give us like an elevator pitch? I know you talked about how it's a bit of a scratch pad, but I wonder, could we dig into less of an elevator pitch, I suppose, dig into the weeds a little bit of like,
sure.
You use that motorcycle analogy, right? You can weave in between the traffic. So I'm seeing that if I want to test out how do I get this information from a collection, I don't actually have to write a massive app that gets a collection into memory so I can mess with it. I could probably, I've used LinqPad, so I'm gonna assume a lot, but I can use LinqPad, point it out in my collection, and then just start playing with that collection, right? I don't have to write the code around it.
That's one of the things it does is it has a powerful visualizer. So it converts pretty much any kind of .NET data into, gives it a nice presentation. So it'll present it as tables and expands all the properties of objects. So it's one of its use cases is to do that. I guess it's probably interesting to think about the history of how it came about. When it was about 16 years ago when I first wrote it, I had one thing in mind, which was that I wanted a way that Linq had just come out at that time. C# 3 had come out and Linq had come out. And you can use Linq to write database, to query a database. And I thought, well, you can interactively write queries in SQL using tools like SQL Server Management Studio. So wouldn't it be great if you could do the same thing in Linq? So I wrote a tool to do that. That was LinqPad so you can just type Linq queries in interactively. And then once I'd released that, it became quite popular, and there were a lot of people using it, including a lot of folks at Microsoft were using it. And I was getting a lot of feature requests. But what was interesting is that people weren't just using it to for Linq queries, they were using it as a general purpose code scratchpad. So rather than creating kind of a new console project in Visual Studio, that they would use LinqPad to run test scripts to do experimental explorational code, or to figure out how to use an API, or for benchmarking or build scripts, automation tasks, data mining, data cleansing. And people were also using it to write new code, because one of the things that happens if you've got a large solution, a large software project, you end up with a solution with lots of projects, and there's inevitable build time involved. So you make a change or you want to write some new code, you've got to then hit F5 or Control F5 to run it, and you've got to wait for this thing to compile. And there's this lag before you can see the outcome. So what people were doing to get around this, they'll go into LinqPad, they would reference the output assemblies of their VS projects, and then start writing new code that uses those types. And then they could get instant feedback, no build times, and all the ergonomics and visualization features of LinqPad. And then once that code was working, they'd paste it back into Visual Studio and save a whole lot of time. And that was kind of how it came about, because the whole idea of a code scratchpad is it's all program-oriented, not project-oriented. So, for instance, with a single key press, you can clone a query and test out 2 or 3 variations of your project at the same time without having to save anything to disk. You don't have to save any of those. You can just press it again and again and create all these variations, test them out, see the code alongside the results. And yet there's no creating project folders, no creating project files, and it makes it's really quick and easy to get the stuff done. So once I discovered this, that this is how people were using it, and I spent the next 16 years adding features and optimizing the ergonomics of LinqPad just for that kind of scenario, for where you want something that's program or script oriented rather than project oriented. So that kind of comes back to that analogy, like having a big truck, as Visual Studio, or any tool that's project oriented versus having a motorcycle. And I figure that if you can, anytime you want, you can switch between the truck and the motorcycle. You can get off one and get onto the other anytime you want. You're going to be a lot more productive.
No, that makes sense, right? Because then you're effectively Indiana Jonesing your way through the code base, right? You're in the truck for when it makes sense to be in the truck, and then you see the bad guy on the motorcycle, you jump out the window, kick him off the motorcycle, and speed off down the street, right? And then you maybe the truck eventually catches up to you.
That's exactly it. Yes. Hopefully you don't fall off your motorcycle.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm interested in then, if you're building this tool, and you've been building it over 16 years, and it's a brilliant scratchpad, then I can imagine that it has lots of different features, and that for every single user, there's perhaps a different either killer feature or set of killer features. I wonder if you can talk to like how you go, if there's someone listening in going, I've got this great idea for a tool, and it's going to be a wonderful tool. It's going to have a bunch of features, but I don't know how to like prioritize which feature to build, or perhaps how do I prioritize supporting users if they all prefer different features, right? Because I feel like that's something that you will have probably had to deal with whilst working on LinqPad, right? So can you speak to that at all?
There is a challenge when it comes to when a project reaches a certain size and you add a certain number of features, you need to make sure that those features are discoverable, but they don't overwhelm the user interface. I think it's a big trap when you try out a new product and it's so cluttered and there's so much going on, it just scares you off. You want to create a user interface that draws people in, that's all of the major use cases are there and obvious. It's simple and clean. At the same time, you've got all these features that people have requested, these very useful features. They're there, they're discoverable, but they don't get in the way, they don't clutter the user interface. It is a challenge getting that right, and there's lots of tricks that you learn along the way on how to do that.
Excellent. And I guess part of that, so there's tricks to building a user interface that doesn't get in the way. And I suppose there's also tricks to perhaps managing the expectations of those users, right? It's come up recently. So we're recording this 2nd of May, 2024, and I think it was only a few weeks ago it came up on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it. The artist formerly known as Twitter, I suppose. And somebody had posted a screenshot of an app called the bulk renaming utility. And this is a fantastic piece of software. It's a Windows piece of software. You open it up, you say rename all of these files, except that it looks like there's about 1 million different controls that you can do, that you can use in the UI to change how it renames things. And this isn't me trying to throw shade on that app. It's a brilliant app. It's just, for my personal tastes, the UI is a little bit busy. And I feel like what you're kind of saying here is you have to make sure that the UI is as unobtrusive, I guess, as possible, right?
Yes, everyone's going to ask for their favorite feature to be made very prominent and to have menu items and toolbar items and so on. But you need to think of the bigger picture and make sure those features are discoverable. But generally, I think a good toolbar in an application expresses the essential state of what's going on. So by looking at it, you're getting information, and the most important use cases, the operations are there. It's important to keep those two things balanced together.
Sure. And I guess using your analogy earlier of like a truck or a lorry and a motorcycle, the user interface for those two devices, I suppose, there'll be similar things, right? You've got a speedometer telling you how fast you're going. Maybe if you're driving manual or stick, you've got a rev counter so that you can figure out when you should be changing gear. You may have a fuel gauge and maybe a temperature gauge, but you won't also have like brake temperature gauges or total weight load, right? Because those things aren't exactly pertinent whilst you're moving, right? It won't have a vehicle height marker, because you should probably know how tall your vehicle is before you set off, right?
That's it.
And so I think you're right there. The most important things in the UI are the things that give the user information they need right now, right?
That's it.
Amazing. Because I'm thinking of, so I know a fellow listener to the show, fellow .NET developer and previous guest on the show, Cliff Aegis, works as an airline pilot. And I've seen the cockpits of those things. That does not look like they've gone with the most pertinent information in the user interface.
Yes, it's got very different requirements that go, they're not trying to attract new users. They come fly our plane and buy one for fun. They're not trying to do that. It's a very different set of priorities to have.
But then I suppose if you look at, I don't know if folks who are listening, or indeed you, Joe, have had the chance to look into a cockpit for a plane that a person could buy and fly around as a hobby.
I have looked. Yes, I've looked.
The user interface in those is way simpler, right?
Yes, the Icon A5, I think, was one of the famous examples of that. Mm-hmm. They tried to create a plane that would be fun to fly. They're trying to appeal to a kind of a sports enthusiast with that plane. A few people have died flying it, but the plane's actually isn't that dangerous. I think it's just people get overconfident. But it is possible to create planes like that.
Yeah, where that user interface is much more simplified, because perhaps a person doing it as a hobby or as an enthusiast probably doesn't need to know all of the information that a commercial airline pilot needs to know at a moment's notice, right?
Yes. Yes, that's partly the case, but also they can go to a lot more effort to optimize the user interface if they're creating that kind of plane. In that, if you're a commercial pilot and you're doing it for a living, you expect it to adapt around the plane.
Absolutely, yeah. Obviously, listeners, we have veered away from LinqPad. We will come back to it. We're hoping to use this metaphor to just to underline the fact that yes, you can have every single control ever on the user interface, but do you really need it, right? So we've talked a little bit about building that sort of user interface out and making it pertinent to the user at the time. And we've talked a little bit about the fact that users, especially of LinqPad, will have different expectations of what their killer features are versus what everyone else's killer features are, right? So, for instance, I use LinqPad a lot to figure out the optimum query pattern for the data I'm looking at, whereas someone else might be looking at, like you were saying, I've got my binaries, I've exported them, I want to build something that interacts with them. I can do that in LinqPad, and then copy the code over to another, like a solution area, and get to that. Both perfectly viable problems to solve, both perfectly viable killer features, but likely both completely different in the way that they're implemented, right?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, and I hope you don't mind me, I'm probably not inventing this phrase. I've very rarely invented anything new. The idea of building a tool as a platform, which is what I see LinqPad as. So I see LinqPad as it's a tool, but also, like you were saying, it's the platform. You're jumping on the motorcycle to get you through to the solution quicker. So then you can then put that solution back into your solution. I'm very wary that I've just said solution like 15 times, but hopefully everyone's getting what I'm talking about. So you touched very lightly on sort of the history of it and how it came about, when Linq came about, and how you started building it in one direction and then you saw other people using it in different ways. But like, I wonder if you could talk about perhaps the original idea for, like, maybe was it just a case of you heard of this thing called Linq that was coming out and you were like, cool, that'll be awesome. I'll build a tool to help people do that because it's kind of confusing. And then maybe could you talk a little bit how it's maybe evolved over time and maybe the history of it?
Sure. It's an interesting thing you mentioned as thinking of LinqPad as a platform. I wouldn't have thought of it like that, but it is, in a sense, it is a kind of platform in that it provides a runtime, which you don't ordinarily get. So if you're doing a standard .NET project, the whole idea is that you're creating, in the end, an executable or a library that can run by itself without the environment, right? It just needs the .NET environment, doesn't need Visual Studio or code or anything else. But in LinqPad, you can interact with the host, the environment, and you have this also this runtime that provides all this extra services. So in a sense, it creates a platform. So things, for instance, it has things like an integrated password manager, which can look after your protect API keys, so you don't have to store them in your source code, and built-in OAuth engine for self-authentication, two-factor authentication, and so on. So the idea is that if you code using those things, it's more conducive to scripting scenarios rather than creating standalone applications. So in that sense, it is a platform.
Right. So then what about the history of how it's evolved over time then? Because I'm going to stand here and say I don't really know a great deal about Linq itself, and I don't feel like that has evolved. It's just gotten more optimized. Like, has LinqPad evolved?
Yeah.
Because Linq has evolved, or because there's just been new tools added and new things? And hey, it would be great if I could have a secrets manager, and it would be great if I could have a connection string manager and things like that.
Yeah, it's Linq hasn't changed fundamentally that much. They've added new methods and so on, but LinqPad's evolved around all of the extra scenarios involving code scratchpad scenarios. It's mainly evolved around those. And in terms of Linq itself, and some people still ask, what's the advantage of Linq over SQL? And there's a number of them, but I think probably the killer one is that all your association properties are automatically generated. So you don't need to join. You almost never need to join tables. So you can just query right through those association properties effortlessly, and that's one of the reasons that Linq is more productive for querying databases.
Excellent. I think for the average .NET developer who maybe has a little experience with SQL, then in my opinion, Linq is way better, more effective, more productive for that developer than going away and scripting out a series of SQL statements with a whole bunch of joins to be able to extract that data and go, oh, right, yep, no, that's why the problem is. There is a null in that column and it shouldn't be null, but it's nullable. What have we done? How did we do it? Whereas, in LinqPad or indeed in Linq, I can just go select, table name dot select or dot where the column name is null or something like that, right? It's super simple. It then joins everything together. Now I agree with that. No, I absolutely agree with the fact that it's way more productive for those who have experience with it. Like there might be .NET devs who are maybe long in the tooth SQL DBAs as well, and they may be like, actually, doing the SQL is more productive. And I'm very much a case of, hey, use whatever tool works for you, right? If you want to go ahead and write the SQL and do it yourself, totally fine. Go do that.
Yes, I mean, I use both. Sometimes it is better to use SQL. In some cases, it does work best. So I just use whatever works best in the scenario.
Excellent.
The following is a paid advertisement. Welcome back, .NET enthusiasts. This is another episode of the Modern .NET Show, and today we have a unique collaboration with industry expert Jamie Taylor. Known for his insights on our show over the past 7 years, he now brings those expertise to your doorstep as an external contractor at RJJ Software in both B2B and C2C engagements. Jamie has been instrumental in helping businesses across the UK harness their digital potential through custom software development tailored to their specific needs. For our US-based clients, he's facilitated transformational change by integrating cutting-edge AI technologies into their systems, all while maintaining his stellar reputation as a thought leader in the field of .NET and software consultancy. Whether your company is looking to elevate its UK operations or reshape its US strategy, Jamie can provide tailored solutions that exceed expectations. Reach out through RJJ Software today and let's unlock your business's digital potential. The audio for this advertisement was created with AI.
So we do, I thought it would be a good time now just to talk about something that one of our community members has brought up. So when we had put this episode together, I reached out to the community and said, hey, if you got any questions for Joe, please do let me know. And Devin, who is a huge fan of LinqPad, has got a couple of questions. And I thought this one might be useful because it kind of fits in a little bit with their history and how LinqPad has evolved. And maybe this is the next step. This question is, we are not being held to anything, folks. We are not revealing any information here about where LinqPad is going. I'm just asking into the ether a question from Devin. So Devin has said, is there a chance of perhaps a cross-platform version of LinqPad? I use it every day, but there are a lot of people who can't because they're not on Windows. Based on some of the UI rendering features, it looks like you're already experimenting with Avalonia. Is that the case?
That's the case. I'm hoping that Avalonia will provide a way forward with that. Because a lot of it's written in WPF, and it's a relatively easy-ish transition. It's not, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easy-ish transition from WPF to Avalonia. So I'm hoping it's going to become possible because the product it's been 16 years of work. There's a lot of features that all need to be ported across, and so some things are much harder to implement than you would think. I mean, something, for instance, like showing the data in grids is unbelievably difficult to get that to work, and to do that, to port that to another to work on our Macs. I don't even right now know how it could be done. But I'm sure there's a way, but it's very, very difficult to port those kind of things across. It relies on numerous low-level Windows Win32 API calls, and all of that has to be done. And it's something that I would like to do, and I'm putting effort into that. But I can't give any particular time frame as to when or if that's going to happen. But it's definitely it's something I consider I would really like to do.
Sure. I mean, it makes total sense, right? .NET's gone cross-platform. But again, it's as and when. And remember, folks, it may just be Joe who's working on this on his own. One developer, perhaps. And that's, we should always be respectful of one developer's time, right? We recently had the XZ, was it XZ? No, ZV? I can't remember the name of it. But the recent backdoor into SSH,
yes.
Which relied on the fact that, and I hope not to trigger anyone, but that particular attack, which took 14 years to implement, relied, or was it 14? A number of years. I want to say, yeah. The timeline for it is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. It relied on the fact that the sole developer who was working on it was suffering from mental health issues. Right? That's how that attack happened. The person who injected the code took over the code.
Yes, you also don't know really who that developer was. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't think we know entirely who, or even if it was a person or an organization. So there was a bit of a mystery as to what was actually going on with that. But it was clever. I'll give it that. It was clever, but obviously very malicious.
Yeah, and the point that I'm getting at here, folks, is obviously, if Joe's working on this by himself, Yeah, cut him some slack, right? He's a normal person too. He needs to have some time off and figure some things out himself. So we've talked about Devin's question. We've talked about perhaps there might be a cross-platform version in the future if some of the WPF stuff can be ported across easily because it's using some Win32 APIs. So let's talk about big technical challenges then, because I always like to talk to people about some of the challenges that they've seen and overcome, and maybe if you're willing to share some of the clever things that you've had to do to make LinqPad evolve over time, right? So I wonder, what were some of the biggest technical challenges you've faced when you've been developing or indeed in maintaining LinqPad?
One of the hardest things to write was a debugger, because for LinqPad, a debugger is not as important as it is in Visual Studio. You can do a lot of stuff without debugger because of the way it works, but it's still sometimes really useful to set breakpoints in single step through and have a watch window. And writing a debugger is really difficult because it's a kind of an arcane API. There's not many people using that API. Not a lot of documentation on it. It's very difficult. And the only thing harder than writing a debugger is debugging a debugger. When something doesn't work correctly, it can be really hard to figure out what's going on. Sometimes it just requires experimentation. And that's something I dislike. I always like to try and understand exactly what's going on underneath and then try and, from that understanding, make something work. I don't just like trying random stuff. But sometimes with debuggers, you have to sort of, with those arcane APIs, you sometimes have to try random stuff. It's also debuggers. It's a bit like a kind of a sausage factory, where you don't really want to know how it's made. So the stuff the debugger has to do in order to work is pretty horrific. It's has to spin up a particular thread in isolation and get that to execute a function just to get the value of a property. And there's so many things that can go wrong, and it has to abort threads as well and suspend threads. So it's a lot of fun getting that to work. And getting the debugger I wrote is, I wrote it just when the C#5 was coming about. So I was able to use all of the asynchronous functions in C# to do that, which was really good because the whole debugger is completely asynchronous. So it never freezes ever under any circumstances. And that was very satisfying, writing that.
Yeah. I know you said there, like the high level stuff about, building a debugger is hard and, debugging debuggers is, quis custodit is post custodes, which is fake Latin for who watches the watcher, so who debugs the debugger. And like playing around with threads and aborting and pausing and halting and all that kind of stuff. Is there any advice you can give to folks who are like, I want to build a debugger? Or is like the advice, don't build a debugger?
Most people won't need to build a debugger, but I guess that to look for if there's existing code or libraries that can help with that. But there's no way around some of that pain, involved in that. But it's fun. I enjoyed it. Some of the other challenges I've had are being very. I need to produce a lot of code quickly to be very efficient in how I code. So, and there was a feature I implemented recently to create an AI chat engine, which I've integrated into LinqPad. So it connects to your ChatGPT account, and it uses the OpenAI API, or it can use the Azure OpenAI API. And so you can ask questions about your code, and then it will give you responses, and then it lets you then merge those responses, those changes into your code, and shows you like a source control different style to show what it's going to do. So, but in writing that, I needed to write quite a lot of UI and write it quickly and efficiently. So I did actually, I wrote it in LinqPad. I wrote that whole AI user interface in LinqPad. And because I'm using WPF normally you use XAML to create a user interface. And XAML is, in a sense, it's easy. In a sense, it's hard. XAML, because it's not a programming language, you end up with a lot of repetition. And you end up with an impedance mismatch between the XAML and the C#. So I wrote a handful of extension methods, and I was able to create the whole user interface entirely in C# without using XAML, almost not at all. And what that did is it's way more productive. So because everything can be a variable, they don't have to put constants in there for things like margins and so on. So it makes, with that kind of slightly out of the box approach, I was able to probably get at least double the productivity. I was able to get things out twice as quickly. And I was also able to develop it in LinqPad, so I got instant feedback, right, without needing a designer. So it's a bit of out-of-the-box thinking, but there was no impedance mismatch anymore. It's all just C#, and it had C# has exactly the same shape as a XAML. If you just add a bunch of extension methods so you define the whole user interface fluently. And I think that's a kind of another language. Having a domain-specific language to define a user interface, I don't think is an efficient way to work. I think it should all be done in the same, if you're using C#, you should be doing the user interface in C# too, because C# is really expressive. Like it wasn't in C#1. Fair enough, they wrote WPF back with C#1 was around and C#2 was around the corner. But nowadays, it's such an expressive language. You can easily define a user interface in that language and then have all of the compositional qualities and the abstraction power of C# in that language. And it can, make you a lot more productive.
Oh, I agree. I just want to, before I bring up a point about building C# UIs in C#, I just want to rewind a little bit and focus on the fact that you used LinqPad to build the UI for a new part of LinqPad. I think that's brilliant.
That's right. I also used LinqPad there's a VI emulator, a Vim emulator, and I wrote that whole Vim emulator in LinqPad, and it was really productive. But there was one problem I ran into, because if I introduced a bug into it, I wouldn't be able to fix the bug because I'd break the editor.
Wow. So then how did you get around that then?
I just had a robust undo facility in there. So it didn't happen that often, but that was really, really quick because I actually hooked it in so that it actually hooked into the live editor as I was updating it. It would change the editor. So I got that Vim emulator implemented really quickly.
Right. Oh, that makes total sense. Your point about C# UIs being built in C#, I completely agree. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When C# first came in the scene in version 1, it wasn't very expressive. It could do a bunch of stuff, but there wasn't a great deal there. But now we have the evolution of the language, the syntactic sugar, all of the wonderful extension methods and stuff that sits on top of C# that allows us to do.
That's right.
I don't know if you've looked into it recently, but .NET MAUI has this ability where you can define your UI in C# notation rather than using a version of XAML.
Oh, that's good to hear. I didn't know about that. That's good to hear, because with object initializers and extension methods, you can do it really well in C#. It's good that the MAUI are taking that on.
Yeah. Because that was I remember I got to about 5 years ago and realized, hang on, WPF is something that I've not really ever used for anything. So I went away and tried to sort of go, right, okay, so I'm going to build something with WPF in XAML. And then somebody went, which version of XAML? And I'm like, what do you mean? Because there's all the different flavors and stuff. And I'm like, it shouldn't be this hard, folks. This shouldn't be so difficult. It's a UI framework. What are you doing? So I totally feel the pain that you're talking about there, about how the UI should definitely be describable in C# if you need it. Absolutely 100%.
I guess one interesting side note to that, a little bit of a tangent, is the fact that Microsoft haven't invested that much in WPF has meant that the API is staying really constant, hasn't changed much at all. So if you want to find a solution to any problem, it's there on Stack Overflow, and it doesn't vary depending on which version you're using. Right? It's a canonical API, and it was in many ways very good API. And it stayed that way. So there's this wealth of knowledge on the internet on solutions for every problem. One of the things that makes it really, I think, good to use overall.
Absolutely. It's like one of the longest lived UI frameworks with a rich API for sure. Not the longest, but one of the longest lived.
It's one of the longest. And I think Microsoft would have preferred if it wasn't that way. I think they've been trying to get us to use other APIs, but developers have decided that what they're going to use, right?
Well, I mean, we're actually recording this the day after Xamarin has been sunsetted. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Xamarin hasn't lasted as long as WPF. Yeah. My own personal opinion is that the announcements weren't made that loudly, and I think that's partially, just because there's so much going on in the Microsoft space, And also it requires members of the community to go, hey, did you read this yet? But yeah, so May 1st, 2024,
I see.
Xamarin is now sunsetted.
That's not, but Maui is still going.
Yeah. So Maui is, .NET Maui is the evolution. Yeah.
Yeah, so they're sunsetting like the old version of effectively of Maui. They're not, yeah.
So .NET Maui is still a thing. I just want to make that really clear because some people online mistake a lot of stuff to do with .NET Maui. So in case folks clip this, .NET Maui, still a thing, evolving, moving on, continually growing. Xamarin has been sunsetted and has fallen out of support, that kind of thing. No more support from Microsoft for Xamarin. Please do your own due diligence, but there was a blog post, and I will link it in the show notes, from a few days before we recorded. Now, this will probably go out in about a month's time, but a few days before we recorded, there were a series of blog posts about, hey, folks, just so you know, Xamarin is being sunsetted. So if you're not sure, do definitely do some Googling, read the Microsoft sources, not the community sources, because sometimes the community sources get a bit hyperbolic and say things that aren't exactly true. So just to clarify on that, I always feel like I need to, because I feel like the .NET Maui team get a lot of shade thrown at them because, maybe they're not innovating as fast as other people would like. And so people keep saying, this is not me saying, this is people saying, .NET Maui is dying, blah, blah, blah. No, it's not, folks. .NET Maui is a going concern. In fact, the day after we recorded this episode, there was a brand new episode of the podcast interviewing someone from the Maui team. So they wouldn't be on the show if they were killing it off, would they?
Makes sense.
Absolutely. So yeah, long story short, Xamarin has been sunsetted by the time you're hearing this, folks, and .NET Maui is the future. So, but it's interesting that WPF is still a thing. It's interesting that they've kept it around.
If they could make it cross-platform, that would be really great.
Yeah, well, I suppose that's what Avalonia and Uno Platform, and I think there's a couple of others. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they are achieving, sorry. It's not that they're trying and not being able to do it. They are achieving it.
Yes.
But I suppose it's slow work because of the things you had mentioned, like some of the Xamarin, sorry, I said Xamarin again. Let me retract that. I'll leave it in, but let me retract that. Some of the WPF APIs rely directly on Win32 APIs, which haven't been cross-platformed. And so they need to create like a binary compatible layer that sits between your app and the underlying Windows 32 API, which doesn't exist if you're running on a Linux machine, right?
Yes, I think also they need to pay homage to the things that are specific to each platform. So I think if you're going to, if they would go down the path of something like Avalonia, the idea is rather like a web app. You want to create a user interface that's going to look pretty much the same everywhere. You don't want to make it kind of different for each platform. You want kind of a similar user interface, but there are some little details, like things like menus and taskbar and so on, where you need to specialize it. So finding that balance is not simple. And to get everything working smoothly, flawlessly, and performing well, it's much harder. I can understand it's much harder to create a good cross-platform rich client user interface framework than it is to just say create the core non-user interface to make that non-platform.
Oh, 100%, 100%. If you're enjoying this show, would you mind sharing it with a friend or colleague? Check out Podcatcher for a link to the show notes, which has an embedded player within it and a transcription and all that stuff, and share that link with them. I'd really appreciate it if you could indeed share the show. But if you'd like a few other ways to support it, you could leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. So if you head over to .netcore.show/review, you'll find loads of ways to do that. You could consider buying the show a coffee. The Buy Me a Coffee link is available on each show's show notes page on the website. This is a one-off financial support option. You could become a patron. This is a monthly subscription-based financial support option, and the link to that is included on each episode show notes page as well. I'd love it if you could share the show with a friend or colleague, or leave a rating or review. The other options are completely up to you, and are not required at all to continue enjoying the show. Anyway, let's get back to it. I often sit and think to myself that okay, so this is Jamie's personal opinion corner. I wonder sometimes whether it's even worth trying to create a single cross-platform UI that looks the same elsewhere. Because like you're saying, you're not paying homage to how the apps are meant to look on that platform, right? So like
Sure.
the way that an iOS app looks is different to the way that an Android app looks.
Yes.
Because they are different user interface paradigms, different design systems, different design languages.
Yes, to some degree, yes.
Yeah, and it's different to how, say, a Windows app works. And let's just sidestep around the Linuxes for a moment, because there are a million different desktop environments and a million different ways that Linux apps can look. So we'll just sidestep that one because that's the difficult one. That's the one that we hop over. We're coming to a point with macOS where it's slowly converging, and iOS apps are looking a bit like macOS apps, and macOS apps are looking a bit like iOS apps.
Yes.
Totally fine.
One factor that's happening is that with so many apps now becoming web apps, if you run an app in a browser, it's going to look pretty similar no matter what machine you're on. So in that sense, we have become much more accustomed to having a more kind of a homogeneous environment. And it's a sense we don't need necessarily to make, certainly with a desktop anyway, with desktop apps, we don't need to make them follow all of the kind of the local bits of Chrome exactly. Like if we create something which kind of looks a little bit like a web app, which has got pays some respect to the local controls, but overall, we don't want to put too much burden on developers. And a lot of people are using things like Electron, right, to develop apps. If people are happy with Electron apps, there's no reason why we can't have a rich client UI framework that delivers a similar kind of cosmetic experience to an Electron app. And that will take a lot of burden off developers for cross-platform applications.
100%. 100%. The web browser is the cross-platform UI, right? I feel like a lot of software developers don't want that to happen. And yes, there is some, like you said, if you're happy with using an Electron based thing, then use it, right? It's about what gets you from zero to productivity as fast as possible, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I mean, we've had a bit of a dalliance about UIs. That's pretty cool. So jumping back to LinqPad then, I'm interested to know, but obviously I'm very respectful of the fact you may not want to give away the secret sauce, but I'm interested to know about how you're like evaluating what the user is typing as they're typing into LinqPad. Like, are you using expression trees? Are you using, some other thing? How does that all work?
LinqPad uses the Roslyn APIs, which is the C# code as a service that Microsoft have published. So, and that way it can get full compatibility with the C# compiler. But it doesn't use the MS Build toolchain at all. So it does it all just using the lower level Roslyn API. So that way it can optimize the performance. So in a sense, there are expression trees, but they're Roslyn expression trees. They're not the kind of Linq expression trees, if you like.
So then does that mean that they're like, what are the potential pitfalls for doing that then? Because like I'm now thinking I can type anything into LinqPad and it's going to run arbitrary expressions within LinqPad in that contained space. It's going to potentially run that against my data. Can I reach out of LinqPad and reach into the file system? Can I, is LinqPad now an attack surface?
Yeah, well, it's no different to Visual Studio in that respect, in that it creates a process for each query. In fact, creates one in advance and warms them up so there isn't a lag, but it uses a separate process to run each query. And those processes are running in the same trust environment as the host, just like you would if you were using Visual Studio. So it's not designed to be a sandboxed environment. There'll be kind of very special cases where you could possibly benefit from a sandboxed environment, but it's not really designed for sandboxing. It's just designed to let you get stuff done.
Sure. Okay. So, and this is a terrible example. It's a really bad example, but if I load up LinqPad, and I probably can't do this, and I write some code in there that deletes everything from one of my drives, and I run it, that's my fault. I should have known what I was doing. It's not LinqPad's fault to be a sandbox. It's not protecting me from it.
Yeah, it's exactly like Visual Studio in that regard.
Yeah, just like Visual Studio Code, just like any other programming tool, right? That makes sense.
That's right, yes.
So I just wanted to get to that just so that then people can't say, oh, well, I downloaded Joe's tool, LinqPad, and I wiped my computer, and it's obviously his fault. And it's not. It's you pushed the button, right? You typed the code. I'm not trying to throw shade on this person, but...
Yeah, it does what you tell it.
Absolutely, right? I'm not trying to throw shade on this person, but there was a number of years ago where someone had logged a issue with Visual Studio Code because they'd done some work and they'd hit the undo my changes button in the Git extension, and it undid their changes. And he said, that's not fair. It shouldn't have done that.
I see.
It's like, well, you pushed the button, dude. What did you want it to do?
Yes. I mean, that's very interesting because undo in Git, I mean, Git has this kind of a very interesting model where it seems it's append only, right? So, and that undo would almost seem to violate that append only, except I would put money on that still being recorded in the ref log. So I reckon if they looked at the ref log, they would be able to redo what they'd lost.
Sure. Yeah.
But that's a bit of a tangent.
Absolutely. I think the problem was that perhaps it was user not understanding what the button did. Perhaps it was documentation was not included for the button. Perhaps even there was no confirmation. But even so, right? They pushed the button, it did what it was supposed to do, and they were complaining that it did what it was supposed to do. Maybe because their understanding wasn't correct. I'm not trying to throw shade at them. I'm just trying to say, look, if I download LinqPad and I do the equivalent of format C inside of LinqPad, it's going to format my C drive because it's just running the C#.
That's right.
Roslyn as a service, right? So it's not doing anything extra. It's not going to intercept that and say, hey, do you really want to do that? That seems like a bad idea. So I know that when we were initially discussing this interview, I've said it before on the show, but ahead of the recording, we sometimes do a discovery call, have a chat about what kind of things we want to talk about. You'd mentioned that you were using expression trees outside of LinqPad on other things. And I was wondering, just because you kind of piqued my interest, is that something you can talk about?
I'm using them within LinqPad, but not for the compilation path. So expression trees, it's an interesting feature of C#, and it's the feature that makes it possible to make iQueryable useful. So iQueryable is an interface that allows you to basically wrap up like an expression, right, or a LinQ query, and then convert it, say, for instance, into a SQL statement. So that's how you can query a database. But what it does is that if you have a Lambda expression can either evaluate to a delegate, like a func of T, or it can evaluate to an expression of func of T, right? So it's a bit kind of low level, but if you do put expression of func of T into that, you will end up with something which is like the compiler creates an object model that describes that expression, that Lambda expression. So it's a powerful feature, and it has other uses, besides querying a database. And one of the things that I need to do in LinqPad is to have the host communicate with all of the query processes. So every time you execute a query, there's a whole bunch of other things that LinqPad needs to do as well, where it creates a separate process to run something in isolation. Right, your query has to run on its own process because it can be debugged, and you can't debug your own process. Right. Also, a process can run things like a Stack Overflow exception, right, which takes out the whole process. It has to be separate. So that process now needs a way to communicate with the host process. The two need to talk to each other. And there's a lot of elaborate communication that needs to go ahead for some features such as, results in data grid, right? That requires an elaborate dance between the two processes. So that communication has to occur, and there's a whole bunch of methods that you need to call in another process. So in order to come up with something, you need some kind of remoting framework to do that. Now, Microsoft pulled the plug on .NET remoting. It had its problems anyway, so I needed to create my own kind of better version of remoting that I can use to allow those processes to talk. And that's what I did. And that relies heavily on expression trees. So what expression trees allow you to do in that instance is that you can call a method in another process. just by giving it, providing a Lambda expression that says, this is the method I want to call, with all the parameters. So it's all strongly typed, all compile time checked. And by doing that, at runtime, it converts it into an expression tree that you can have a look at. And then you can serialize that and convert that into ultimately a series of bytes that you're going to send across a pipe into another process that will pick up at the other end. So, and I think it's one of the nicest features of C# is that it provides these really powerful things like expression trees and Lambda expressions and Linq expressions and asynchronous functions. But at the same time, it also provides really good low-level stuff like pointers. And that's something else that I needed to actually get this done, because in order to get the two processes to talk to each other at a low level, you also need some way to create a kind of pipe between them. And it's very demanding, the kind of pipe that I needed to get the performance, and also to be friendly to a debugger, which does some really nasty things. So in the end, I had to write my own pipes, and I did that using pointers. So I ended up having the same like a stack of layers of software. I had stuck the bottom using these low-level pointers and the top using expression trees. And it's all done in one language. In the past, without C#, would have to go to use, you'd have to write that in C++ and use some interrupt or something. But you can all do that in one language. And that's something, I really like about C# is it's got that huge range from low-level stuff up to the very high-level stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of, how do I put it? I don't want to say C# detractors, but that's kind of the phrase I'm looking at. A lot of the people who sort of poo-poo C# don't kind of realize that. They, for one reason or another, see C# as, and .NET as, it's a Windows thing. They maybe don't know that it's cross-platform, and they see C#1 and they say, hey, this is the language and it's never evolved from there. Whereas actually, we're on, what are we on now? C# 12?
12.
Yeah. So, it's evolved at an average rate. It isn't this, but at an average rate of every 2 years. That isn't the actual rate that it's evolved at. That's like an average. It's been 24 years. We're on version 12. So it's averaged out 2 versions a year. And we get great strides when that happens, right? It's not just like, a couple of years ago when they brought out IAsync enumerable and a whole bunch of other features, and all people talked about was IAsync enumerable, which is a great thing, but there are loads of other features involved, loads of other cool things. Select, what is it? It's not select, it's pattern matching, and being able to slice into select ranges of arrays and collections and stuff. It's really cool.
Yes, I've continued to develop the language.
Yeah, and that's something that the folks over on the C# language team are actively involved in doing. And I feel like, I'm not saying that other languages aren't being left behind, but there is some stagnation, I suppose, with things. But then that's because things move slowly. It's fine. And I figure just before we sort of wrap up, I wanted to ask this other question that came from Devin, who's in the community, because I feel like it's a really cool feature that's included in the documentation. And I feel like it's something that doesn't get talked about a great deal. So just before we wrap up, hopefully we've got a few more minutes to cover this. Devin had said in his question, please make sure you dig into how the included documentation, tutorial, and reference information works. It is super cool that it's all done as native LinqPad runnable queries. It's a really neat way to learn. If anything, it's similar, but not the same structure, but the same idea to things like Jupyter Notebooks and .NET Interactive, but predating either of them by a long time. I guess that's less of a question and more of a, here's a cool thing you should talk about. I'm not even kidding when I say it's my favorite development tool, hands down, is what he's saying.
That's very nice to hear. Yeah, the whole tutorial and reference is just a big tree of LinqPad samples, and you can search those. You just Control F1 and you can search, and that's the help. So it gives you an interactive sample that you can run that demonstrates a feature. And it's also linked from a lot of the auto-completion tooltips. So if you use a particular feature of .NET or LinqPad, and it's the auto-completion tooltip will often have a link to take you directly to an interactive sample to demonstrate how that feature works. And that is one of the ways you can add lot of features to your program without cluttering the user interface, because that is a discoverability point, right, for that feature.
And that loops back around to what you were saying towards the beginning about making the user interface such that the user can then discover things that are pertinent to them at that time, right? It's a discovery-based interface.
Yes, that's right. Interactive samples it's a great endpoint to get to.
Right. But yeah, that's really cool. And folks should definitely check that. If you've got LinqPad and you've never used it, you should definitely jump into the help system and just search through that, just run things from there. It feels very much like, from what we've talked about today, LinqPad has very much been used to build the LinqPad to provide the features of
called
LinqPad,
dog
right?
fooding. Yes, that's called dog fooding, and that's how you create good products.
Yeah.
Because if there's anything wrong with it, I'm the first to feel the pain.
Absolutely. And for those who don't know where that term came from, it's quite literally from selling dog food to people. Would you give the dog food you are selling to people to your own dog? That's where it comes from, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yes.
So, Joe, as we're wrapping up now, because I realize we're rapidly running out of time, what's the best way for folks to learn about LinqPad? Is it just go to the website and check out the free version and then go, hey, this is really cool, I'm going to give you some money and pay for a paid license?
Yes, just download it and have a play with it. It's a very lightweight product with a lightweight installer and an Xcopy version as well. The premium license, which unlocks the extra features, is $125 at the moment, so it's not a hugely expensive product. And you have a play with it and see how you get on.
Amazing. So what about if folks are like, hey, I've got a question for Joe. Is it something they can, like, are you on the artist formerly known as Twitter, or is it more a case of go to the website and fill in the contact form?
Yeah, on Twitter at LinqPad. And there's on the website, there's links to there's a forum as well.
Excellent. Okay, so we can get questions out to perhaps other users of LinqPad as well and get some community response too. Amazing.
Sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Joe. This has been a lot of fun. And like I said at the beginning, I'm a big fan of LinqPad. And I feel like more people should be using it, because it is a fantastic tool. It's another one of those tools in the toolbox that I reach for when I need to use something, right?
Sure.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Modern.net Show with me, Jamie Taylor. I'd like to thank this episode's guest for graciously sharing their time, expertise, and knowledge with us. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at the podcast's website, and there'll be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to .netcore.show/review for ways to do that. Reach out via our contact page at .netcore.show/contact, or join our Discord server at .netcore.show/discord. All of which are linked in the show notes. But above all, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope that I'll see you again next time for some more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks.